Happy Wednesday. Today is Wednesday, October the 28th, 2020, and today's daily Bible readings are Psalm 119, 41 through 48, Deuteronomy 26, 16 through chapter 27, verse 7, Matthew 19, 16 through 22, or you could have read all that except switch out Deuteronomy for Proverbs 16, 1 through 20. So if you really like Proverbs today, today's your day. Today, though, I'm going to look at Deuteronomy, that passage 26, 16 through 27, verse 7, and we're going to talk about what it was God wanted the people to do when they finally got to the land he had promised to deliver them into. So he's given them the law, given them the commandments, and now he's telling them what he expects of them when they get to the promised land. And the first thing he wants them to do once they cross over the Jordan River into a land flowing with milk and honey is to stop and build him an altar, but not just any altar. He's very specific about what kind of material he wants in it. He's always specific about the kind of materials he wants in the things that they build for him. But he says he wants them to build him an altar out of unhewn stones. So what's the deal with that? Well, he goes into finer detail about that. He says stones on which you have not used an iron tool. In other words, you have not dressed the face of them. You haven't squared them up. You haven't done everything to make them perfectly usable stones, in other words. Now, I have to think, for people who had just spent generations in bondage building the idolatrous altars of their oppressors, this was probably a breath of fresh air that they weren't going to have to do that. Now, granted, it would be God using the skills that they had developed there to worship him, but he's doesn't want that. He doesn't want any part of that, and for good reason. There's like I said, they used those skills. They used iron tools to dress the face of stones that were dedicated to idols, to false gods, to a person who set himself up as God. So that's probably an important thing for them to realize. And the other thing is that, like I said, if you're not going to use dressed stones, because if one of the things they did is they would take these rough stones and they would put them in a nice square plum shape so the stones would fit neatly on one another. If you're not going to do that, that means the stones you've got are hard to handle. So the idea is that they go out and they use whatever stones are at hand. And luckily for them, there's a lot of stones at hand in the promised land. I'm assuming that they're there on the banks of the Jordan River, so there's lots of river cobbles, which are not perfectly shaped. There's lots of probably just broken field stone that's tumbled down off the hilltops that they can use. But with that kind of living stone, it's hard to work with. It doesn't make things easy, right? It doesn't do what you want it to do. It doesn't just fit into place like you want it to fit into place. And when you do get them all together, there's lots of gaps and cracks, which is probably why God's like, once you put it together, cover it with plaster. Just smooth the whole thing over with plaster. And so these stones are really hard to work with, but, God prefers his creation as he finds it, right? And it makes, he makes it work into his plan rather than forcing it into a shape that it wasn't found in, right? God has the ability to make things that are odd and weird and just not square, not plumb, work into his plan. That's why he's God. He pulls it together. He takes all these odd things and pulls it together, smooths it all out through the presence of his Holy Spirit, I suppose. But isn't that kind of just like Israel? Israel was not freshly hewn stone. It wasn't, nice and square and plumb. The people of Israel were a bunch of wild living stones that were really hard to work with. They didn't fit together. They didn't do what it was he wanted them to do or expected them to do, and he pulled them together somehow through his presence into this altar to him, this living altar. We're all rough-cut stones, aren't we? If this sounds familiar to you, Peter talks about this. Matter of fact, in our video for the function last week, I talked about Peter, who talks about the cornerstone and how we're all living stones laid onto that cornerstone. And I think about this every time I hear that text, because I really think It's an image of the people moving into the promised land, not only just building an altar, but becoming the altar, becoming the abode of God on this earth. And none of us are really easy to work with. We're all these rough cut stones. But God chooses to work with us, and he's not put off by our oddness and our misshapenness. So, don't worry if you're not as polished as you think everybody else is, because the truth of the matter is nobody else is that polished either. God's not deterred by your oddness, your brokenness, your pointy bits, your flat bits that shouldn't be flat where you need them to be pointy kind of thing. God can smooth it all out through his presence. He'll pull us all together. So just remember that. That's the DBR for today. Have a good afternoon, good evening. We'll see you tomorrow. Boop.